Now, this is linked, of course, to the climate debate, and there's been a lot of talk today about Labor's moves to reassess its policies, especially its climate targets. Leading the charge has been its resources spokesperson, Joel Fitzgibbon. He joins me from the Sydney CBD now. Thanks for joining us again, Joel. You're really going ahead with something we've talked about before on this program, your assessment of realistic targets for 2030. In this speech tonight, you're going to clearly say that Labor should just agree with the Paris targets, that is the upper end of the Paris targets, 28% by 2030?
Yeah, good to be with you, Chris. Yeah, look, what I'm saying tonight is that emissions are rising year on year under the current government, despite what Scott Morrison gets away with saying. Of course, his Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, admits regularly that emissions are growing year on year. So if we're going to get some meaningful action on climate change, we need to start holding the government to account for that. But what's happening is that every time someone seeks to hold them to account, they start talking about Labor's more ambitious targets. So I say, let's remove that barrier, let's force them to be accountable, and let's hopefully force them by agreeing to work with them to at least get to 28% by 2030. And look, if we could achieve that, it's a fairly meaningful reduction given at the moment they are rising. And if we can get to that without, while at the same time demonstrating that we've got there without forsaking jobs, well, that would be a good foundation on which to talk about more aspirational targets into the future.
I think this is a very important point that your friends on the left especially need to get their heads around. That is, if you agree to the Paris target, if it's a bipartisan political target just to 2030, that hardly means you're going to agree with the government on everything. For instance, as you say, firstly, you really want to hold them to account to push emissions down. The latest evidence shows that they're failing to get the emissions down and might not meet that target. And secondly, the mechanisms to do that, there's a myriad of different options and schemes and plans and policies that you can bring in to get those reductions in place as efficiently as possible.
And we do need to talk at least as much about innovation as we do about carbon constraint. And look, 28% probably is too modest to meet our Paris obligations, but gee, getting to 28% would be much better than what Labor's current policy is delivering, which is zero, because we're not in government. And it would be much better on what Scott Morrison is currently delivering, and that is growing emissions year on year. So I think it's time to have a bipartisan and sensible debate. I mean, the electorate has spoken on this issue too many times now. It's pretty clear it's going to be difficult to take the electorate with us, but I think we can take them with us if we're working on a bipartisan basis. And if we can get to 2030 and get to 28% reduction without losing jobs, without damaging the economy, then we'll be well placed to say to the electorate, look, that was okay. We've demonstrated we can do this, and maybe take them with us on a more ambitious journey.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I've got a weight loss goal of getting down to 85 Ks. That's probably pretty modest, but once I get there, then I can think about a more ambitious target. Now,
well, if I'm 100 kilos, Chris, and I get to 70, that's a pretty meaningful outcome, I would have thought.
Absolutely. That's a sensational outcome. Now, I was very surprised speaking to your colleague Matt Thistlethwaite earlier today, where he linked the current drought and bushfires to climate change. He says that's the evidence of climate change happening now. That's the sort of alarmism we hear from Extinction Rebellion and Bob Brown, and the climate science simply doesn't back it up.
Well, Chris, this is where you and I might rumble just a bit. I mean, our landscapes are on fire, our towns are literally running out of water, our farmers are in crisis, and something's happening out there. Our droughts are getting more regular, they're getting longer, and very importantly, they're getting hotter. And we've got a lot of bushfires out there early because it's warmer, and we've got a lot of dry fuel. Now, so my view is the climate is changing. The only argument you want to have, and it's a legitimate one, is whether humans are making a contribution. I think they are, but I appeal to you to just sign up to the precautionary principle. If in doubt, do something about it, because in another 10 years, it may be too late. And that's my other point. We cannot afford to wait another 3 years and allow, throughout that time, emissions to continue to grow. By the time the next election comes around, Morrison's mob will have been in government for 9 years. So in this next 3-year period, if we can turn that growth around, stabilise it, then we can talk about getting to 28% by 2030, and if we can achieve that, we can talk about something more ambitious.
Yeah, Joel Fitzgibbon, sorry to not rumble with you, but I mean, it's all about the science. This is my only point. It has to be about the science, and it should be precautionary. And the point about droughts and bushfires in this country is that we've always had them. It's not to downplay the hardship at the moment, but we had a terribly severe drought back in the late 2006, 2007. Of course, the worst ever drought in this country back around Federation. And just have a listen to Professor Andrew Pittman, who's Australia's leading expert on this, and he's certainly a qualified climate scientist and one who certainly says that there is anthropogenic climate change.
This may not be what you expect to hear, but as far as the climate scientists know, there is no link between climate change and drought. Now, that may not be what you read in the newspapers and sometimes hear commented, but there is no reason a priori why climate change should make the landscape more arid. And if you look at the Bureau of Meteorology data over the whole of the last 100 years, there's no trend in data. There is no drying trend. There's been a drying trend in the last 20 years, but there's been no drying trend in the last 100 years, and that's an expression of how variable the Australian rainfall climate is.
Joel Fitzgibbon, if that's what the science says, then politicians who link the current disasters to climate change are being opportunistic and misleading.
Well, Chris, the fact is that every scientist you put up to put that proposition, I can find another 20 to give the counter view. But look, let's just put that aside for a moment. This whole debate is premised on the idea that you can only reduce emissions or take meaningful action on climate change at a cost to the economy. And I don't accept that is the case. I do believe we can take meaningful action on climate change without forsaking jobs and without damaging our economy. And part of that, of course, will be a greater focus on innovation rather than, as I said, just on a carbon constraint.
Now, just finally, if you do succeed in Labor having a more centrist, I suppose, more achievable, more moderate climate policy, there's every expectation you might lose votes to the Greens. This is what your critics will say, and that'll be the argument held within the Labor Party. Do you believe you'll be successful, or will the socialist left of the Labor Party try and cut you off at the pass?
It's certainly true, Chris, that we can't win the next election without securing the requisite number of rural and regional electorates. But it's our job as politicians to show leadership and appeal to people to consider this. Do you want to just leave things as they are for the next 3 years under Scott Morrison and continue to allow emissions to grow? Or should we try to accommodate the government of the day and come to some agreement which puts the pressure on them to actually reduce emissions between now and the next election? If we could get them down by the time of the next election, then I think, again, you'd have a good foundation to mount the argument that we should continue on that path and everyone would be better off as a result.
Do you think this policy area was one of the main reasons you lost the election?
I think it was a very significant issue, particularly in rural and regional Australia. Blue-collar workers feel threatened by the spectre of a carbon tax, a carbon constraint, whatever you might like to call it. And I think all politicians have got to take responsibility for that. If the electorate ever gets it wrong, Chris, if we haven't been able to persuade them that meaningful action is necessary and worth the cost. And part of that process is being able to persuade them legitimately that there doesn't have to be a cost and that the cost of doing nothing might be much greater in any case.
What about 50% of new car sales being electric vehicles by 2030? Should that target go too?
Oh, well, all those policies under review, Chris. I don't whinge because I've said many times that if you open yourself up to a scare campaign, that's what you can expect. But they were new car sales, Chris. They were a threat to no one. And as you know, that we are a world laggard in the adoption of electric cars. We do need to get better. And I think if governments could encourage people somehow, whether it be just rolling out more fuelling stations or whatever it might be, that would be a good thing, because we do have too much focus on coal generation.
Yeah.
When the fact is that the industrial sector and the agriculture sector and the transport sectors are also making massive contributions. So if we can do with an economy, if we can take an economy-wide approach, then the focus doesn't so much need to be on coal generation.
Yeah, well, that's what I called it, 50% new car sales by 2030. I was just interested where it's at, and obviously, as you said, all these policies under review. Appreciate you joining us today, Joel. Good luck with the speech tonight and the policy battle ahead.
Thanks, Chris.